First of all, I do want to say that I don't know if I have the most reliable internet service. People don't seem to have an issue with me doing it, but it gets a little jumpy on my side. So if for whatever reason you cannot hear me, by all means, put something in the chat just to let me know, and I'll pause until I can function properly, or my computer can function properly. So I am working for the Douglas County Election Commission. I am one of only 13 permanent staff that facilitate our elections here in Douglas County, which considering the volume of people that we handle and being the largest, the most populated county in the country, not in the country, but in the state, it's pretty surprising that we can get it done. I think part of that is because we have very dedicated staff. I don't believe there's anyone there that is just there to get those good county benefits. Everyone is there because they care deeply about the democratic process, in particular the democratic process here in Douglas County. So there, I handle the people power that it takes to work our elections. Our elections can take anywhere up to 2,800 people to facilitate on election day. And there's work that happens before election day and after election day. So coordinating the recruitment, the training, and then facilitating those crews on election day falls on me. So I'm who to blame. If someone does not deliver good customer service to you at the polling place, by all means, let me know. And I'll have a stern talking to you for them. So for this so that's a little bit of my responsibilities there. I come from a nonprofit background. I mean, I'm used to working, and for instance, right now, the social justice upheaval right now, that's what I'm used to. So it's strange being in the world of elections, but it's not too different. I would say it's a different social justice focus working for our elections here. What I'm going to do is share my screen with you. If you have any questions, by all means, participate in the Zoom group chat. If there's something that you want to send to me personally that you do not want other people to see, maybe you have a concern or whatever about our election process, by all means, share that just to me individually. You could do that by selecting the caret right by everyone in the Zoom group chat and then selecting my name. And I'll try to keep an eye on that, Laura. And Deb, if you can keep track if there's a question that I'm not seeing right away, if you can just call my attention to it, I'd appreciate it. So I'm going to share my screen now. Oh, and it says the host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Just a minute, let me fix that.
Can I say, though, I highly appreciate a moderated Zoom meeting. Someone needs to be in charge someone has to be the ringleader for this circus.
It's fixed.
Good, thank you. Change this one. Okay, bear with me. I'm gonna go to enterprise. Oh. Okay, so I already did a little bit of introduction for myself. And so one, I just want to get into the meat of it here. We are the Douglas County Election Commission. We're the largest county in Nebraska by population. We have over 510,000 people in Douglas County. Unfortunately, only about 360,000 of them are registered voters. So shame on those who have not registered to vote. Surely everyone that I'm speaking to right now has registered and is an active participant in our democratic process. So of those 357,413 registered voters, here's the breakdown. So we have 127,000 Republican registered voters, 137,000 Democratic voters, which I always think is an interesting number because I come from the state of Oklahoma where, you know, they're in Oklahoma City, they're in Oklahoma County, which is the seat for Oklahoma City, which is the capital of the state. We have more, just like Omaha, we have more registered Democratic Party members, yet we still elect conservative members. So that's an interesting, that'll be an interesting study to do. And then libertarians and nonpartisan. And the nonpartisan, I want to say, does continue to grow. These are individuals who don't want to associate themselves with any party affiliation here in Douglas County. Maybe their beliefs, their political beliefs jump the spectrum. More often than not, they're frustrated. They don't like anyone in either party. So that's where they put their allegiance to giving no allegiance to anyone. Some people would call that independent, but in the state of Nebraska, independent voter means something. So we do nonpartisan, which means no party affiliation. Those numbers are active since May 29. So I bring this up. Back in the day when COVID was just on the horizon coming back to us, it's important to realize where we were at the start of this year. So on January 21st, the first case was confirmed here in the United States. Of course, now we've learned that the first case was actually much sooner than that after going back and doing some forensics on infections here in the United States. January 23rd, the Wuhan was on lockdown by that point in China. By January 30th, the World Health Organization had declared global health emergency. And then on January 31st, the US Public Health declared a public health emergency. February 6th, we had our first death here in the United States. And then locally for the Election Commission, we mailed out our selection letters, not necessarily understanding the impact of what was going on overseas and just beginning to rear its head here in the United States. So we were business as usual. I mean, our elections, and people always wonder what we do on off election years or the months in between. I would like to think I was sitting there twiddling my thumbs and collecting a check from, county government, but our elections process starts months in advance. I love it. I love it when someone calls up the day before the election and says they want to volunteer. I'm like, oh, you're so pretty that you think that we can just do it at the last minute like that. But people have to be vetted. There are other processes in place. So the planning takes place way ahead of time. So we mailed our selection letters February 26th. By March 13th, Trump declares, of course, a national emergency. And at that same time, we're looking at training and how we facilitate training to our poll workers. We start limiting our class size. We go from a class size way back in the day, we used to have hundreds of people in a room. Then we cut it down to 125, and that's what we've been operating off of. But for this, we decided, we're going to reduce our class size by half. We're only going to have 60 people in a room. That way we can do social distancing. But by that point, like I said, there wasn't a lot of guidance on what to do, but we saw the writing on the wall. We began meeting then and talking about, okay, what is the worst case scenario? And what do we need to start looking at now in case this becomes it becomes that worst case scenario? So before we received any guidance about what training was going to look like or what large gatherings were going to look like, we cut our participation in half. Now, what did we go off of for those classrooms from going to 125 to 60? One, we knew about social distancing. We knew that ideally it would be 6 feet. I know in other countries it ranges anywhere from 3 feet to 6 feet. Here, it's just more commonly 6 feet as far as social distancing. So we looked at the room that we were in, and even though we didn't have the guidance, we were like, what is the psychology of allowing people space? And if people are comforted by the fact that we're giving them space from other people, that to us is low-hanging fruit. We will do that if it makes people feel safer so they can be in this space and be trained. So that was on March 13th. Now, during that weekend, of course, news was unfolding. Just like us here in the Election Commission office, you were at home seeing what was happening on the ground change from day to day, sometimes multiple times within the day. So over the weekend, it looked like class sizes were going to be mandated to be under a certain limit. And so once again, there wasn't any guidance. So we were looking, okay, what's drastic? For us, what's drastic? And so we thought, okay, if things got worse, surely 25 people would suffice. So we went from 125 people in a room to 60 people in a room to allow for social distancing. And then that weekend we were looking at, okay, 25, that's kind of our break. I mean, it makes sense for us to put, we have the capacity to do 25 because we have, over almost 2,000 poll workers that we have to deal with. And we don't want to do classes till kingdom come, but we looked at it and thought, okay, we can do 25 people in a class. We would just need more classes, adding more days on. Of course, we did planning in advance, so we had space set aside, and we always reserve more space than we need just in case. None of us ever thought that just in case would be a pandemic. And then, of course, comes Monday, and Governor Ricketts releases his first directed health measure, which limits gatherings to 10 people. So below our 25. So our plan C was now being negated by the directed health measure. And at that point, by the afternoon, by mid-afternoon, we just recognized it was not worth it for us, that we needed to look at alternative means to train our poll workers. And what that actually means here in Nebraska is that every poll worker, no matter how many elections you participate in, so if you're a longtime volunteer like we have and you've served over 43 elections, yes, we have people that have worked that many elections, you have to go to training before each and every election. So that person has gone to 43 different trainings over their volunteer career with us. And so we have people that do have to, it's mandated by statute that they receive that training. And one, we want them to have that training. We want them to make sure that they're facilitating our elections fairly. And more importantly, things change. There is a primary election here in Nebraska and anywhere is a very different demon, not to be negative about it, than a general election. I mean, think of all the parties. Thankfully, here in Nebraska, we have the Republican Party, we have the Democratic Party, and then we have the Libertarian. That's only three. I mean, there are some places that have multiple parties, and they're dealing with multiple ballots. So when our election workers on election day are inundated by the number of ballots, the sheer number of ballot types, we tell them, yeah, it's frustrating, but it could be worse, which surprisingly does not give them a lot of comfort. And so by the 16th, during that weekend, we reduced our class size down to 10 after the decision. And then by April 3rd, we had reached this desperate means. We were doing statewide call for volunteers to have poll workers. And I'll get to why that's such a big impact on us, talking about the sheer number of poll workers. I just love this tweet really quick, just because, very different days. Of course, we're all used to different days these now since 2016 for some of us. So for safety measures, we knew that our elections were going to be different. We didn't know what that was going to look like. None of us had ever gone through a pandemic before, just like any of you. And people kept saying it's unprecedented, but we knew that it wasn't unprecedented. This had happened in our history before. This had happened during the pandemic in the early 1900s. So we knew historically what had taken place in at that time period and what from that could be applicable to us. We knew about the mask. We knew about the limitations of gatherings. We knew about how those limited gatherings were abused, even in the state of Nebraska. So we had some historical context about how things were done. And that was really because I had myself done the research. I'm like, what actually happened back when we had a pandemic? And amazingly enough, there was a research paper that was done at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, probably about maybe over 5 years ago, about what was happening here in the Plains during the pandemic and how were communities handling that. And then they had a section about how our elections were done. And so when it became very clear to us that the elections were going to be happening, I would reference, well, heck, and during the pandemic, Spanish flu pandemic, oh, we did our elections. Of course, I conveniently left out the spike that happened after our elections had taken place back then during the pandemic, just hoping for the best in a world where people would wear their mask, but they didn't do it then, and they definitely are not doing it now. The grocery store is any indication for us. So we had three groups that we were really focused on protecting. And at the end of the day, this is what we are these are the groups of individuals we are concerned about whether or not there's a pandemic. It's our voters. One, are they given the services that they're needed? And now during this time of pandemic, how can we deliver those services to them and do it safely? The next group of individuals are the election workers. We knew by that point, we were pretty, well, I would say in the beginning, we did not know. I mean, we were making plans to have an election with people at the polling places. We were making plans to have completely by mail. So we were already looking at, if one of those happened or both of them happened, how did we need to separate out or change our work plan with the number of people that we had so we can do this. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And so in addition to our voters and election workers, we had our staff. And I don't want to put them on the end of the totem pole here, but, and I'll get into detail about, their functionality during this as well. So what we were telling them, so going to the first group of individuals that we were trying to protect were our voters. And so at this point, the greatest thing that we could do, the safest thing for everyone across the board, for voters, for election workers, and for our staff at the election office, was to encourage voters to vote by mail. One, it keeps voters out of a place where a large number of people are gathering. Some of our polling places have, a line wrapped around the block. And one, the feasibility of dealing with individuals, that a large number of individuals going to a polling place and then trying to maintain social distancing. And then what was our capacity to police that? Could we administer the elections fairly and also do crowd control? We just didn't think that we were able to do that. So we had been hoping that things would change from everyone having to go to the polling place and doing by mail. At our old building, when we were doing in-person voting at the Election Commission, you can do that before Election Day, we had people wrapped around the building going into the parking lot. It was a sheer number of people who were voting multiple ways. At the end of the day, we want people to be able to vote in a way that's convenient for them. So we do by mail, and we do early in-person voting, and then we do voting at the polling place, which I personally love, and I miss it just because I love the sense of community and patriotism I feel being in a polling place. So how successful were we in encouraging voters to vote by mail? As an example, for the 2018 primary, the last primary election with the highest number of by mail voting requests, we received 72,000 by mail voting requests, which in itself is impressive considering people in Nebraska like to vote in their polling place. I mean, they will fight tooth and nail for the ability to vote in their polling place. I understand that. It makes sense to me. Of course, I'm less impressed when there's a pandemic. So how successful were we for the 2020 primary, this past election? We received 147,603 by mail vote requests. Now that in itself would be amazing turnout for any election, but for this one in particular, because we know across the board, from voters all the way to poll workers, there is not a lot of interest in voting for a primary or helping with the primary. They're always like, sign me up for the general. There are a lot of people who, I've had individuals come into the office that weren't even aware that a primary was going on. Their attention was already on the fall for the November general. Now, it's also important to mention the political climate around the country in regards to by mail voting at this time. There are multiple Republican efforts across the country to limit access to by mail voting, which is very strange for those of us who have been around for a while. And I say that like I'm an older seasoned person. I'm not, but I read a lot. By mail voting was once the darling of the Republican Party. It was something that gave, white voters who happen to be able to have the luxury of travel not to miss out on voting, and how that's expanded now where anyone has greater access to it. Now Republicans are making efforts to limit access to voting by mail. In our own state, Governor Pete Ricketts and Secretary of State Robert Evans and Bob Evans both ran on campaign platforms that specifically took a stance against by mail voting. So it was interesting for us to see what would actually happen here in Douglas County in regards to by mail voting. Now, what helps us out here in Nebraska is that we're very organized. Douglas County is very organized in coordinating efforts when it comes to policy and improving and streamlining the voting process, even in addition to by mail voting, just the voting process in general. So we call it the big three. It's ourselves, Douglas County. We work in coordination with Lancaster County, which is the second largest populated county in the state of Nebraska, and then also with Saftey County. So geographically, we're all very close. Geographically, we all are able to get together on a very regular basis and affect policy that's happening here in the state when it comes towards elections. Yes, ultimately, our single responsibility is administering elections fairly here in Douglas County, but we do have a little bit of influence about how we can suggest changes to that. Ultimately, it's up to our legislators here in the state about how our elections are administered. We just humbly follow state statute. So we had 3 of the largest counties in the state demanding that by-mail voting happen across the board, across our counties. We knew it was the safest way. We understood, because unlike some of the other election commissions and county clerk's offices across the state, we knew exactly what was involved in by-mail voting, not just the budgetary needs for materials for by-mail voting. We were very aware of the human capacity it was going to take to do this properly and to do it timely, especially at the last minute. So we were advocating loudly behind closed doors that this election be done completely by mail, that you don't have to request a ballot, that you are automatically sent a ballot, which is what a lot of counties under a certain population here in Nebraska, if you're under 100,000, if you're a county that has a population under 100,000, you can do any of your elections, all of your elections by mail, and some of them do that, which is great for rural Nebraska because of the geographic area you have to cover. I mean, it's a burden, it's an undue burden on people to travel that far to vote. Because oftentimes there's going to be one location. Oftentimes, they don't even have a place at the county office for you to drop off a by-mail ballot, because that would be an inconvenience for people to drive all the way to the county seat to do that. So we were aware of the convenience. So if you're over 100,000 like us, there are very limited opportunities to do by mail. So if we're doing something like we have SIDs or smaller, like the Bennington Fire Department has an election to elect members to their board, those types of things we can do by mail. And in those instances, we are making the decision of whether or not the decision about doing by mail or in person isn't up to us. I mean, the Bennington Fire Department could have just said, oh no, we're old fashioned here, we're gonna vote by mail, and then we would have to deal with that. We would charge them depending on which one we went, but it's their choice on how we do it. So you have your election commissions are trying to improve processes out there. They're trying to be an advocate, because we understand better than our legislators, probably better than our governor, or even our Secretary of State, about what will actually work better for voters. The other thing is, so how does by-mail voting work here in Nebraska? We are very fortunate here in Nebraska to be a no excuse state. Now, what does that mean? In other localities, for instance, in Texas, to vote by mail, it's only available to those individuals who are 65 years or older. You have to be either 65 years or older, you have to be someone who's disabled, you have to be out of the country on election day, and during the period of in-person early voting, so you're unable to appear in person to do early voting or at the polling place on election day, or you're confined in jail, but otherwise eligible to vote. Frankly, I was just happy to see that they were allowing people to vote in Texas that were in jail. I thought that in itself was a pretty progressive for Texas. So it's very restricted on who can vote by mail in those states. Like I said, we're very fortunate not to be a no excuse state. Now, we weren't always a no excuse state, but once again, our election commission and legislators advocated for no excuse voting. There was a recent case here in, not here, but in Texas, where people were applying to be excused from, to be able to vote by mail in Texas from the fear of COVID. But the Supreme Court of Texas said that's not a good enough excuse, that you have to be, it's not enough to automatically get a ballot just because you're in one of those vulnerable categories. So if because in Texas, if you're over, just because it was 60 and above, doesn't mean you're going to get a ballot from us. You had to request one in writing, and not only that, show proof that you're vulnerable. So you had to talk with your physician and send in paperwork. Some of these places make you get these statements notarized, or the by-mail applications need to be notarized in order for them to receive them and process them. And then there's not necessarily the biggest guarantee that you're going to get those things as well. So what's happening in Texas and the difference what's happening here in Nebraska, it's important to remember that the United States is, a federal republic. Each individual state has the autonomy on how they function within their borders, which includes also how they conduct their elections. So be glad that you're in the nice state of Nebraska, where Nebraska nice means also fair elections. So the early voting request list. So in addition to voting by requesting by a by mail application, so you have to do that in the state of Nebraska. State statute says you can only apply to vote by mail 120 days before an election. So if you're someone who likes to get things done early, Nebraska is not the state for you. I'm sorry, but the workaround is that we now have something called the early voting request list. And some of you who voted by mail this time, which there was a lot of you, thankfully, that voted by mail, you may have seen an option. There is a checkbox on there to see if you wanted to be added to the early voting request list. So that's the ability to, instead of having to apply every election, you're part of the process now. And I do want to jump back just to see why that's important. Because one, when you're doing it by mail, you have 120 days to apply. And then after you submit your application, then you're sent a confirmation card to verify. You have to verify that's where you live and that you haven't changed your mind and that you still want to vote by mail. Because if you don't send that card back into us or we don't receive it, our assumption is that you're going to vote in person, that you just thought it was going to be a beautiful day on election day and you wanted to be part of the party that was happening on May 12th for this election. So then you return your card if you want to vote by mail, and then the ballots are mailed out approximately 30 days. So it's not as simple as signing up one time and then getting your ballot automatically in the mail. It's different for every election. So what this does, what the early voting request list does, is eliminate the application. So it eliminates that burden. So you're still sent a confirmation card, and it's important for us to do the confirmation card for the simple fact we want to eliminate the appearance of voter fraud. So we want to lessen the sheer number of ballots that are floating around out there. So we already plan when we do our elections for 90% of the population here in Nebraska, the 90% of the registered voters to vote. Now, all of you know 90% would be amazing. We're lucky. We're lucky. That would be a miracle into itself, but we don't even come close to that. But here in Nebraska, for Douglas County, that's our default. We plan for 90% of the population, the registered population, to vote. Now we stay away, some people call this a permanent request list. We shy away from that word permanent just because you can remove yourself at any time from that list. You can add yourself back as many times as you'd like to that list. And plus you don't automatically receive that ballot. Some people hear permanent and they think I'm automatically going to be sent a ballot. We want to differentiate between what is a permanent request list and what we call the early voter request list. And remember, for every election, you must return your confirmation card. So really quick too, because I think this is important, particularly for this election, how secure is by-mail voting here in Douglas County? We heard a lot of concerned citizens that were concerned about by-mail voting and that they felt like they were being forced to participate in a potentially fraudulent process, even in times of COVID. So it was a weird balancing act to have these conversations and ensure them that the process was safe. So have any of you heard of any concerns about by-mail voting? Do you have any concerns about fraud, or have you heard things about fraud or the process in voting?
I've only heard that the Republicans are quote, worried about it, but I haven't heard talked to anybody who's personally been worried about it.
And we hear even some of our poll workers who are very well informed about the voting process, have concerns about it. And in particular, the last one on this page. So one, some of the safety measures that we put in place, just to let you know how secure this process is, we have specially designed envelopes. So for us, we were smart. We saw the writing on the wall that things were going to go south as far as the pandemic. Even before anything was officially claimed, we went ahead, even though for this election, we ordered already close to 100,000 envelopes because we have seen the projections about where early voting was going to go. And we knew that even then it blew our numbers out of the water for the 2018 general and then in-person voting for 2018 general, that we were scrambling to get more ballots ahead of on election day. So we knew that it was going to be very, very popular and something that's only going to increase in popularity here in Nebraska. So we ordered at the time 20,000 extra envelopes. We just knew. We knew that this was going to be a different creature than what other people were projecting here for Douglas County. So we have specially designed envelopes, and plus, those envelopes just aren't off the shelf at Office Depot. They have an oath, they have other information on there for verification and for distribution. They take time. They take 2 months to turn those envelopes around. So that's why we got them early, just in case. And plus, they're made specially for us, and we designed them in particular. And this wasn't always the case. They were used to be made for each election. We made them universal and generic enough that we can use them for other elections. So it wasn't going to hurt us having them sitting on the shelf. These are materials we could use again. And one, we can accept a ballot. Even if you yourself are the person who voted that ballot, and you can come into our office and show that you're the person that's on that ballot, we will not accept your ballot. We need the envelope because, one, it is part of the process. You sign something to be a part of this process, and at the end of it, when you vote, you sign something at the end of that process to close it, just to verify. So we verify every signature that comes into our office, whether it's on the ballot, whether it's on a petition, whether it's on a voter registration application. Every signature is looked at in our office. And some people, just to let you know, I don't know why, you may have up to 3 or 4 different types of signature on file. We have pictures of all of those. Some people sign differently when they're in a hurry. Some people sign differently when they have all the time in the world. And heck, we all sign differently when we're signing something electronically. I don't even recognize the person who's signing some of these things for myself. And so one of the concerns that we also hear is why don't you require an ID to vote here in Nebraska? And I tell people, because in Nebraska, an oath, your word means something. And that's something that we prosecute to the fullest extent of the law if you are dishonest or you refuse to attest for your character. Now, doing the every ballot counts, because I think some people hear that the votes aren't counted on election day. Every vote is still counted. Sometimes it takes a little longer for those provisional envelopes that people who, for whatever reason, couldn't use a normal ballot, so they had to vote provisionally. Those may take a little bit longer to count because we verify identity first before we count them. But every ballot that's mailed in by mail voting is counted. In fact, they're counted a day early. We start that counting process. Now, we aren't even ourselves aware of the results. The machines tabulate them, and we don't even know what the results are until we add them into the election day counting, just so none of that can be skewed. I think for myself, the greatest concern I have for voter fraud, the potential for voter fraud in Douglas County, is more so of the power dynamics in some intimate relationships. So if you're someone who is in an abusive relationship, maybe you have a spouse that's going to dictate how you vote. That's my concern, because to me, the polling place is a place of anonymity, it's a place of safety, it's a place of privacy, and that would serve some people better. That's my greatest concern about the potential for fraud in our election. So that doesn't affect everyone.
Michael, we had a question as to how many ballots were not counted because the envelopes weren't signed.
Not as much as you for the envelopes. So we had, oh gosh, I was trying to look at the number. I was waiting to hear back from our by mail voting application, but I hate to say it, but it's more than you think. I'm not saying thousands, but one, because we may have received all of those, 100,000+ by mail ballot requests, but we didn't fulfill all of those because we couldn't. They didn't meet certain criteria. Maybe they weren't registered. They thought they were registered, but they weren't registered. Maybe they were living outside of Douglas County. Maybe they had a felony background, because you have to wait a certain time limit, but they weren't aware of that. And we contact every application we get that gets rejected. We contact them and give them a reason why their request wasn't fulfilled. Yeah, even for their voter registration, if they sent in an application and didn't sign it, or maybe their signature looked different, we send everyone a letter saying, we need you to sign something else. We were unable to determine that this is to verify this is you. And so for some of those people, they were able to turn it around and send in another request, maybe stop by in our office and sign the request. But there are some people that just weren't able to do that. Maybe they just didn't have. We have a very transient population in some of our geographic areas here in Douglas County. So people move. So they may have moved in the time they sent something into us, and then when they sent their application. So poll workers, the meat of my job, We have over 237 polling places, and at those polling places for a primary, we typically have 5 people, a team of 5 people that are working at a polling place. Now, some of our polling places we have warden precincts here in Douglas County. Those are the political subdivisions that make up polling places, warden precincts here. And some of our polling places have multiple places, but we try to do a single staff. We've always done a single staff to serve every individual warden precinct. So we were definitely challenged on that for this election. So for the 2020 primary, we typically need a workforce of almost 1,200 people. Now, what we actually ended the day on election day, and these are just the poll workers, those individuals who are working at a polling place are poll workers. We have other election workers that are working at the office. We had only 722 people. Now, what did that mean for us? That meant that for the first time in our history for elections here in Douglas County, we not only did we have to consolidate multiple polling places into one, we then had only one staff. Instead of having one staff per warden precinct, we had a staff serving 2 or 3 ward precincts. And for those polling places that just had one warden precinct, they only had 3 people processing voters instead of the 5 that they were used to. And when you have processes that are specifically tailored for 5 people, and your worst case scenario is losing 1 poll worker for a short amount of time because we always send out replacements, the idea of running a polling place with only 3 was unimaginable. Now, like I said, we were worst case scenario people at the Election Commission. We were already looking, what is the minimum amount of people for a given state statute would it take to run a polling place? So we knew that we had some leeway, and this was our interpretation, and then we were giving our interpretation over to the Secretary of State's office. So at a typical polling place, you have an inspector who's the supervisor for the polling place. You then have 4 workers. 2 of those people handle the books, and there are 2 people that handle the ballots, handing them out and then receiving them, depositing them in the ballot box. State statute said that we could dismiss the clerk judges, the two clerks, the people that were handling the books. Those people could be dismissed, and that would leave the 2 judges, and the 2 judges could be appointed to act as the clerks. So that's 2 people there that would assume the duties of the 2 other people that left. So we knew that we would have 2 judges and an inspector. Now, in extreme circumstances, the inspector can then dismiss one of the judges, or we could dismiss one of the judges, and the inspector would assume the duties of one of the judges. So then you would be left with an inspector acting as a judge who's acting as a clerk, and then other person who is a judge who's acting as a clerk. And so we were splitting hairs. Now, our worst case scenario was that we would get down to 2, but we were planning for 3, given the numbers that we had. We were planning at most of these polling places to have only 3 people administering our elections. So one of the things we put together an FAQ with how this is going to impact people. So I want to go through this just to give you a little bit of background of what our thinking was. So these common concerns, this FAQ that we shared with our poll workers, was in a time when there was still a lot of uncertainty. So, and this is in the beginning, is there a contingency plan for the election? Is there a plan B? Is the polling place not going to be open? And we were telling them the polling place is going to be open. One, just because we're old-fashioned in the state of Nebraska. One, we are dealing with a Republican administration that already leans away from voting by mail. And then plus for us in the Election Commission office, we knew that by mail voting wasn't going to reach everyone. We knew that there were segments of the population based on socioeconomics that moved more often than other segments of the population here in Douglas County were not going to be accessible. Maybe they moved and didn't update their voter registration, but just because you didn't update where you live and you vote by where you live, for us doesn't mean you don't get to vote. So for us in the Election Commission office, and also a federal mandate that you have to provide alternative means of voting on election day for someone who didn't register, we knew there was a large part of more people than we realized were needing, their only option was to vote in person at a polling place. And this is the line where I talk about here as an example of our own history. Nebraska still held elections during the pandemic of 1918, keeping our democracy intact. And then I conveniently left out the part about the spike in cases after the 1918 election. And plus, people kept asking us what it was like because we were planning for a completely by-mail election. We were planning for voting by this point, we knew we weren't just going to be doing in person. And so it's like planning two elections. We compared it to, preparations for, to planning a wedding for 100,000 people. And that any moment the groom could bolt. So you're wasting all this time and effort to make it happen, but you do what you're supposed to do. That's just the way, in a lot of ways government works. Even if the iceberg is coming, we still staff the ship. We're still swabbing the decks, even if it's going down. And so one of the biggest questions were, at this point, everyone was doing social distancing and the capacity was down to 10. How are you doing this? Well, we could have easily said, because in the directed health measure for the state of Nebraska, we were excluded. Election commissions were excluded, and election day was excluded from this 10-person limit. So we could have a room of 100 people and be perfectly fine according to state statute, to the directed health measure from the governor. Now we know psychology is important during moments of crisis. And realistically, could we do everything to eliminate the repercussions or consequences of being at a polling place or working at the election commission, the consequences of COVID? We couldn't. But we could not just go through the motions, but go through the uncertainty together with poll workers and with staff and with voters and share with them we don't know everything, but we're working towards a solution. So we recognize the uncertainty of it. And so we knew that people who were on the fence, because mind you, we started the selection process to invite workers because our workforce is about 50% volunteers and 50% draftees. So you can be drafted from the rolls of registered voters here in Douglas County. And just like jury duty, be selected for election day, and you have to serve. Now I'll get into how we handle that during a health crisis here in a little bit, but we rely on that. The reason why our elections are so accessible is because we have the sheer number of polling places. You look at the consequence in other jurisdictions across the country where they limited or restricted the access to polling places. For instance, Georgia, the most recent case of a mess of the democratic process. It's criminal. It's criminal what happened in Georgia. They even before COVID, in good times, they restricted the number of polling places, particularly in communities of color in Georgia, because they no longer had the mandate after the Supreme Court returned certain provisions in the Voter Rights Act to do those measures. So there was a lot less oversight in what the states like Georgia were doing. People threw a fit. After the census, after we moved polling places, people had a fit just because we were basing it off data by population. Even then, we had some uprisings about the changes we made, and we were still maintaining a high number, 237 polling places across the county. And you look at some places like in Georgia where they cut down to like a handful of polling places. So what were we doing to protect poll workers? We're communicating with them. That's the greatest thing. In this time of uncertainty, it was important that we communicate with them and let them know, to acknowledge that, yes, we know that this is difficult. We know there's a lot of uncertainty, but this is what we're doing. So some of the things we implemented, the biggest thing was encouraging voters to vote. That in itself, this one thing to let our poll workers know that we are fighting to get everyone to vote by mail. We sent everyone a by mail application in the state of Nebraska. You have to sign up to vote by mail. We sent every voter in Douglas County a by mail application. We couldn't automatically send them a ballot, but that was as good as sending them a ballot for the majority of people. And that was comforting enough for our poll workers to know that we were doing just that. Now we're also providing PPE, and how unfortunate for the world that we know what PPE is. That we were providing that to the counties. Let me get here, sorry, my notes. So there was some uncertainty. We were planning ahead providing these materials because at the time we were saying we need supplies. Secretary of State, Governor, we need supplies. Us as a county cannot get some of these. What are you doing to make it happen? So they really stepped up, mainly because they were the ones that were also mandating that our polling places stay open. We're like, you want that responsibility? This is all of the responsibility. Find us these materials. So we had the N95 rated masks, the medically rated masks for people. We were fortunate here in Nebraska. We were fortunate enough not to be an epicenter for the pandemic. We had very few cases. We have an amazing top-notch, health facility here in Omaha, Nebraska that benefited us. So this was a community that was as prepared as possible to deal with this pandemic. So we had enough materials, some medical supplies here in Nebraska. We also gave every voter a pen, because at that time it was about contact, touching paper, touching a pen, touching a ballot, touching the voting booth. One of these things is going to make someone sick. That's what we were operating off of at the time. And this, we actually stole this measure from Wisconsin, maybe one of the only things they got right in Wisconsin after this election. And also, we were just once again keeping the lines of communication open. We are working on policies. We're working on procedures and protocol. We don't know what that's going to look like, but we are actively trying to finalize those before Election Day. And this is where it goes back. We're making exceptions for those individuals who were medically vulnerable. We were well aware enough to know that there were some people that could not work. The majority of our volunteer workforce is over the age of 50. So, and a lot of our seasoned leadership, those people that supervise polling places, the inspectors, were aged, in their 60s and not older or older. We have election workers. I have an election worker who's 90 years old, who wanted to work, understood the consequences, even though I sat them down and went through why she's in the vulnerable population, said that this is what she does for her country. So those are the types of people who are working our elections. These are not people who volunteer at a pantry somewhere. These are people, it's a higher calling than just volunteering like you do with other organizations. Side note, her profession is taking care of elderly people. So she is 90 years old and she's taking care of the elderly population. So goals in life, be like her if you can. Going back here. So for the medically vulnerable, sorry, I forgot about that. So we have draftees. We have a workforce that is about 40%, sometimes 40% to 45% draftees. These are people that had to work. Our volunteers are invited to work. Our draftees are voluntold to work. We make exceptions for circumstances, medical, maybe you're over the age of 70, maybe you're the primary care provider for someone, maybe you're going to be traveling, you're out of state, your work is taking you there. We have those reasons. But we were overwhelmed. Thank God, when one of my biggest goals coming on board was to take the technological leap to put everything online, to do everything electronically. In the past, when it came to people submitting, I call them RPs, our postponements, excusals, and accommodations, requests for those things, everything was done on paper. Everything was done by fax or it was done by mail. So we moved that process online. Now, we were fearful because we're dealing with a large elderly population that maybe they wouldn't be familiar with it, maybe they wouldn't be comfortable using it, maybe they didn't have the access technology to do it. But we were surprised. We were overwhelmingly surprised because we did electronic forms for people to sign up for poll working. We did them to confirm their poll working duty. And we had the best response rates that we've ever had because people could do it safely from home. So as an idea, for the last general election, where we sent communication out, we're asking people, verify that you're working. We had almost 700 people that we just did not hear from. Now for this election, we did not hear from only slightly more than 200 people. So that's a really good response rate for us. So one, keeping those processes in this for vulnerable people, having that done electronically, I'm glad we did it because even having it electronically, we were overwhelmed with the sheer number of people to excuse from duty, justifiably so. I had people on the phone crying, please don't make me work. I have diabetes. I'm over the age of 65. Please don't do this to me. And we're like, no, we wouldn't. We just wouldn't. That's just not the type of people we are. And that's just not the type of process that we have. You're doing something important for us. We want to accommodate you as best as we can. So in addition to what was going on with poll workers, like what are we doing in our office? Some of our workforce does work in the office on election day. You know, we expanded cleaning services, cleaning routines at the Election Commission. The day before the election and the day after the election, we did a what's called an electrostatic disinfectant cleaning process. So they came through and cleaned every inch of our building with it, not just cleaned it, but used a disinfectant that was rated to kill not only kill viruses, but specifically COVID-19. There were very few cleaners on the market that actually had that rating, and we used it in our cleaning process. We also adopted the practice of social distancing, even though we didn't have to on election day or in our offices. We did it because, once again, it was the psychological barrier. And there was the CDC guidelines at this time for offices was between 3 feet and 6 feet. Now, we knew in our office there were some duties that we just could not accommodate social distancing, because everything in our office is done in pairs. That's why we, at the polling place, we have people from differing political parties, so they can hold each other accountable. We do that at the Election Commission office. One person does one part of the process, observes it, they do their part of it, and the other person observes it, and there's party balance that's maintained. Some of those things, you have to stand right by someone. We're asking them, are you comfortable doing this? We're getting their consent to make sure they're fine with this. Most people, once they walked into the building, got a mask and gloves, were like, this is what it is. I'm just going to do my job. We were also providing PPE to staff and workers as well, everywhere from gloves to face masks, the medically rated N95 face mask, all the way to face shields. If you wanted a face shield, we were able to procure those for workers. Now, the majority of people didn't use them, but we still had one for every worker just in case. Now, we know that how the better benefit is of course, using a mask, not the face shield. And also, we implemented hygienic and other practices. A lot of this stuff we all know now we should have been doing all along. And so we spent a lot of our time educating people about things they should be doing to begin with, and reiterating the importance of why we do that. So yes, it was an interesting time reminding people, just like in grade school, to use warm water and use soap. That was the safest thing we could do, was using, washing our hands on a regular basis. So on election day, what did we do? These are the materials that we had. What you're going to be seeing here and later on are just some captures from a sheet that we handed out to poll workers on election day. So it talked about the materials that we had. We had everything from painter's tape, so you could mark out where people should stand, and then so we can do the social distancing, and then giving people instructions on how to use the tape and how to measure out social distancing. This was new territory for everyone else. We knew at this time, with these processes that we had in place, that the biggest single factor to help the election process go smoothly for our election workers was to vocally and verbally acknowledge and recognize with our voters that this is a strange situation, to disarm them from the uncertainty of walking into a room and seeing a mostly empty room with 3 people wearing masks, face shields, and gloves. How do you make people feel better about that, especially when you can't see faces? We told them to talk. Tell these voters, acknowledge the strangeness of the situation, like things are going to look different. Isn't this weird? Using that type of language with voters. Being over-exaggerated in your hand movement and your facial expressions, because they can't see the mouth, they can't see the comforting smile of a familiar face. So using your eyes to be happy, using your hands to be happy and to direct people. That was the type of training that we did with our poll workers. Here are some of the other safety measures, and hand sanitizer, all these things. If there was one thing that I wish we could do differently on election day, is I would go back and do more public education with the voting public about the importance of using PPE, and doing more education with our poll workers about the importance of wearing masks. Because at the end of the day, we can't make anyone wear a mask. It wasn't mandated, it was just suggested. So I wish we'd appealed more to common sense, to maybe even tied it into your patriotic duty to wear the PPE. We didn't hand out I voted stickers. People were in an uproar about that. They didn't understand why we didn't want to hand them something that other people had touched. Well, I joked that maybe we should have had, instead of giving people just big pins, maybe we should have had commemorative pins made for I survived COVID and voted in 2020. this talks about how the voting area was set up. Just to give you an idea, I'm not going to go into specifics of that, just to give you the idea of all the things that we addressed. Anywhere from a cleaning schedule. It's not enough to tell people keep the area clean. We had to give them a rotation about when to clean. We had to look at what type of cleaning supplies could be used on certain equipment at the polling place, what arrangements we were making with the polling places to make sure things were clean beforehand, and what we could do while the voting process was going on. We had multiple moving parts even up to election day. And let alone how the voting process itself looked. What we call normal voting was by no means normal voting on election day. We redid everything, and mind you, none of this existed. We redid everything with the idea of social distancing and how they could do it. It was a dance. We gave everyone a dance card on election day that spelled out what they needed to do, who needed to move first, who needed to move second. And just to give you an example of what that looked like, I mean, we broke everything down using the, oh, and I forget why it was on there. But we used everything, what good training tells us, break everything down into discernible chunks. Keep it to 3, don't go over 3. Use simple language when talking with individuals on what they should do next. So everything had to be reimagined for this election. I always told our workers during training, because I help facilitate the trainings, there's no creativity in elections. There's a right way and a wrong way. Well, I have learned that there is creativity in our elections, but there's also still a right way and a wrong way to do it. And finally, so in addition to voters and then our election workers, we did everything we can to protect our staff. We kept the office closed to the public. Other counties were doing, county offices were doing that. And we were handling paperwork, the sheer number, even though we do things online, the sheer number of paperwork coming into our office. There's 13 full-time staff members, but we hire a staff of up to 80 temporary workers to handle the sheer number of paperwork that's coming into our office. Now think of all the hands. If I could tell you about some of the things that come on that paper, all the indiscernible stains that come from paperwork and from the public, you wouldn't want to touch them on a pandemic-free election time, let alone during a pandemic. And that was changing. Do we wait 24 hours? Do we wait 48 hours? Do we wear gloves? Can we make people wear gloves? We were contending with these things as they evolved, the same way it was changing for you and the public. The primary reason that our office closed, because we were still serving the public up until we shut our doors. And even when the doors were shut, we were slipping applications and other paperwork through the little crack in the double doors out to voters. They could only go into the vestibule, the airlock, get their materials and move on. And then pump hand sanitizer, move on with your day. Our primary concern was not that we're martyrs, but we wanted to keep our staff healthy through election day. After election day, the joke was, get as sick as you want, just stay healthy for the election. But we knew that it would break down if our staff, our primary staff and our temporary workers were unable to work. So we're essential staff. We were in the office day. We were told if you're sick, in the beginning, it was like to come in. Eventually, we're able to do some remote access work, but not all people could do that, depending on what work you were actually performing. Our polling places, the drastic changes there. We, moved out of assisted living centers, which, our worry was then how were those people in these facilities? How were they going to vote? This is how they voted. So how do we then work with these assisted living centers to make people to help people vote safely? We moved out of high occupancy living. We moved out of the residential towers that were, that were operated by HUD, the Urban Housing and Development Department, moved out of those areas just because of the sheer, and even though there weren't necessarily health reasons where the staff, it was just the sheer number of people. So we had over 65 different polling place changes across the county, and then having to being responsible to communicate those changes with enough advance notice to the voters so they knew where they were showing up on election day. And somehow we did it. I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Liz Zorko, who handles the polling places. I don't know how she did it. Every time a polling place dropped, I don't know how she didn't have a breakdown, but we did it. So in Douglas County, like I said, we have 237 ward and precincts, and those are facilitated at 222 polling places. And we may have, in a normal election season, we may have what's called a dual precinct. So one polling place happens to have 2 ward and precincts because of a limited capacity or buildings with a certain capacity, but they still have a staff for each one of those. So we consolidated down to 200 polling places. 8 polling places were serving 33 polling places were serving at least 2 warden precincts with 1 staff. And then we had 8 polling places that were serving 3 warden precincts with 1 staff. So it was a very high demand, human demand on our poll workers. So why were we successful? We were agile. We were able to respond quickly. We planned for the worst and hoped to be pleasantly surprised by not getting the worst. You know, as an example, even before things got bad, we were already in talks with county government overall. How do we mobilize? There's a group that has to be sacrificed. It's going to be us. How do we mobilize our county staff who are at this point working from home? How do we say, okay, you're not working at home today. You're actually showing up to this polling place. We were in the process of implementing that plan as Plan B. We had, we're having conversation already with the National Guard because of the sheer number of polling places, the sheer number of people it takes to manage this election. Now we were told you'll get 100 National Guardsmen. And then, of course, they then started a program where they were asking National Guards people to volunteer to do tracking. So they had an overwhelming response, 400 people. So by the time you got around, we only had 25 National Guardmen for our tri-county area to be on the ready to be called for election day. Thankfully, we only used 1 at a polling place and then 5 at the Election Commission, mainly because we needed heavy lifters for some of our activities. And also we researched online training. Our training was canceled for in-person. So you're looking at the time, we were looking at 1,800 people that had to be trained online because you always train more people than you need just in case. We don't release people until shortly before the election, so we train way more than we need. Thankfully, over a year ago, we started the process of looking at what training online could look like for Douglas County. We spoke to over 33 election offices across the country of comparable size or larger, just to see the Cadillac version of what online training could look like. And so we were very familiar with it, what platforms were needed for it. Ultimately, we decided to keep doing in-person training because the thing we noticed with the online training was there were a large number of jurisdictions that could not tell us that there was an improvement or there was the quality of poll worker for training was just as good as in-person. They weren't tracking that, and we track everything. They weren't tracking that, so we were very reluctant to go to just solely in-person training. So we went online. But we know we have a population that's older. We know we have a population that does not have internet access in the home. And by this point, Omaha Public Libraries were closed. And so if we couldn't reach someone at home, all the community access points for internet were now no longer available. So I still did in-person training. We only ended up training 65 people, but for this next election, we're looking at what the Plan B of in-person training will be. Thankfully, we decided because I said, we need to know now. I'm not planning 2 weddings. I can only plan 1 wedding at a time. And so we're planning, our wedding is online for this upcoming election, but still looking at how we need to serve those people who don't have internet access. We had a new facility. I had some pictures to show you, but I know I'm trying to get through, so be respectful of our time. We could not do social distancing in our own facility. There was no way that we could do it. We didn't have enough room for the staff that was working for the election, let alone the volunteers that come in to help on election day. We had one election, I believe this was for the 2016 election, someone who needed to spread out paperwork, and the only place for them to do it was underneath the conference table in the boardroom. That's where they worked. People were sitting in the office like feet to feet down the hallway, staggered, and using their laps to process paperwork. So we wouldn't just not be able to do that. And also we were funded. That was a big thing. Unlike our peers across the country, we're well funded because we know how much it costs to do an election, and we fight for those dollars. And why we get those dollars is, unlike Georgia and Wisconsin, our elections have not become political fodder. They are not the punching bag that they are in Georgia or Wisconsin. And we did not have the political environment where people saying, oh no, absolutely no way in heck are we going to do by-mail voting, only in person. We weren't being putted around like some of our other peers were. So those are the primary reasons that things worked out so well here, is that people were actually concerned about their fellow human beings here in Douglas County enough to know that, one, to step up and volunteer when a lot of our volunteers couldn't do it. And then to stay out of the polling place. To me, that was the greatest act of love other voters can do for strangers, is by staying out of the polling place, because I know how much they value being able to go into a polling place and vote. And that's my final slide. I know I talked a lot, but I'm ready to take any quick questions.
Michael, before you go on to some of this, can you give us some idea about where you stand for the fall general election?
Oh, how do I get back to not sharing? Oh, stop sharing. Okay, never mind.
Oh, you got it?
So you asked, what are we doing for the fall election?
Well, I'm sure you're doing some of the same stuff, but what kind of shape do you think you're in? Do you see any further trends that you're going to have to be aware of? And
yes, just overall, one, we still don't have any certainty about it. One, we know the polling places are going to be open, because if we were all open now, we're going to be open then. We don't know if we are going to do the same thing, because one, it wasn't necessarily our decision to, we advocated for it. It wasn't our sole decision to mail out ballots to every person. We had to get a waiver for that. So if we're going against what's already in state statute, we do have to get a waiver for that. And so that's uncertain. We think people are going to do it because, one, even though their platforms were against it, Governor Ricketts and Secretary Evans were full force behind this. Every opportunity they had when talking in front of the public about this before the primary election, they were constantly talking about the necessity to vote in person. That it was the most Nebraskan thing you can do to take care of your fellow Nebraskan, is by voting in mail. So we were all on the same page, and we were feeding them that language, because we knew what language was going to work to encourage our voters here in Douglas County. So that's one part of it. So we're confident it's going to happen. I know some of my colleagues were like, oh, I think it's going to be all by mail. I'm like, I'm telling you, it is not going to be by mail, all by mail. That is just not the state we are. And one, we cannot guarantee that everyone's going to be reached by mail voting. That was always my stance. That wasn't our stance as the office, but that was my personal stance. We're looking at online training right now, and we're using a learning management system called Talent LMS. Thankfully, being a part of county government, we have access to those types of platforms. So now we're looking, because at the last minute, our in-person up to 2.5 hour in-person training now had to be cut down to an hour. So all this stuff that we thought was absolutely important, and mind you, we whittled it down to 2 hours, 2.5 hours for some positions. We whittled it down even further and put it on YouTube, because we knew people were going to have access to that for the most part. They could do it on their phone. It was mobile friendly. But a lot of our, people that are impacted socioeconomic wise, the only internet access they have is through a mobile device, not through a connection point in the home through a service like Cox or something like that. And so we're looking at now, when we had a quiz too that was online. Now we're looking at this learning management system so we could track how people are doing. We can actually do an actual quiz to see where people are, because before it was like, answer correctly, oops, you got it wrong, do it again, here's the right answer. So we weren't necessarily evaluating people's how much they were retaining information. Now we can do it with this other platform. We can make it much more consumable. We can actually make it improve the content on it. And one that's important for us, because we use that information as one of the many quality points that we use to judge who is going to move up in leadership, even at the polling place or even in leadership up to the positions at the election commission. So that type of feedback is important to us. What hurt me was I love the evaluation process. I figured out a way to do it on our optical scanner, so we didn't have to manually process these evaluations, but we thought, we are setting these people up for failure if we evaluate them on this election, because this is such a unique animal for us. It just wouldn't be fair. It would definitely skew the numbers for our ratings. And so that, and plus, the thing is, we have process in place, Deb. That's the greatest thing that we have, is we've done this already and we're ready to do it again. And we could plan, we could divide out the work a little better. I mean, there was one point where I was working, I did calculations for the 2 weeks before the election. There were less than 44 hours that I was not in the office working for the 2 week period. And so that's eating, maybe running home, seeing Sebastian, seeing Scott, and then running back to the office. The saving grace for me and some of our other staff was, the last time I did this, during those busy periods, I would leave when the house was dark and quiet and come back when the house was dark and quiet. For my own mental health, I made the decision, I will go home for dinner, I will see my child, I will see my husband, even though I'm losing the sleep. It was more important for my spirit to see them. That fed me, Scott and Sebastian fed me more than sleep did at this point. And my mental health at the end of this was so much better than the first 2 times I did this. So I think we're all trained better how we're going to do it. And plus we know, we were joking, someone was joking, like, oh, this is like another month of work. And I'm like, from someone who's worked 2 months in 1 month, I can tell you that we're not going to do that again. So thank you, Deb, for the question. Any other?
Well, somebody asked, Sally asked on the thing, do all Nebraska counties use paper ballots? Is Nebraska at a lower risk for fraud vote tampering because we use paper instead of electronic voting?
Yes. So, I mean, that was the issue in Georgia, just to give people here a little bit of inside information. So ES&S, which is a local, which is the Omaha-based voting platform, they did a bid for the equipment that was used in Georgia. This was the first time Georgia was using that equipment. And the way, so ES&S has a closed loop system. It's all their system, all their equipment. And with Dominion, and the one thing I found very interesting when I was reading about all these equipment errors in Georgia, I had to read 7 articles before I found one article that actually mentioned the company that manufactured that voting equipment, because I'm paranoid. Well, I'm worst case scenario boy, which makes me a perfect fit for the election during a pandemic. I wanted to know if it was our equipment. Here we don't use voting equipment we do it for individuals who need voter assistance, but it's not a tabulator. It's only to mark a ballot. And my concern was, is it messing with the disabled person's voting? Is it disenfranchising them in some way? Thankfully, it was another company. It wasn't ES&S who we use. It was a company called Dominion. And the scary part about their equipment loop is that they're one component, and then the state can go find whatever off-the-shelf equipment they want to use to complement it. So it wasn't a closed loop technology system. And so they're going like to Best Buy or the lowest bidder to get important components for their voting machines. And of course it was a failure. We knew according to Grumbles that it was going to be a mess in Georgia. And then it turned out to be a mess in Georgia.
What are they doing to fix that?
One, investigating. And one, they keep blaming who's training and this is the one thing that really impacted Wisconsin and also Georgia, besides the political fodder that it became, was in Wisconsin. You think there's a county clerk here and or a commissioner that's handling elections for all the counties that we have here. There are even a greater number because it's not managed by the county level in Wisconsin. There's smaller units, so you have an overabundance of election mechanisms that are managing these elections. And sometimes it's one person with no technology background that's trying to administer these elections. And they don't know how much it realistically costs to do a by-mail application, by-mail voting. They don't know what it's like to process a large volume of voting by mail. So they're just uninformed about it. And then for Georgia, what's interesting is the back and forth between the Secretary of State and also the county supervisors or the county clerks or the commissioners, because the way their power structure for elections are set up is that I want to say we have great autonomy here in Nebraska. I mean, like we said, we fought for some of the language that was used. We fought for some of the processes that were used in response to the pandemic. And the Secretary of State has to do a waiver for us, but there's a lot of autonomy that we have. In Georgia, the Secretary of State just isn't the figurehead for elections. They are the supervisor. They have the ability to mandate what's happening on the ground and what's being done and who's in the seat for it. And clearly there was a lack of communication and a lack of funding for what was happening. But you look at a state like Wisconsin and Georgia, where the number of polling places were being greatly reduced. I mean, I'll never forget the horror story of reading about a woman in Wisconsin who did a by-mail ballot ahead of the deadline, didn't receive her ballot, and was waiting in line. Oh, and by the way, she had tested positive for COVID. She knew she was COVID positive, and she was pregnant, but she needed to vote. And the only way to do that was go in Milwaukee County, the highest populated county in the state of Wisconsin, comparable in size to Omaha, Nebraska. We had 200 polling places serving 237 ward and precincts. They had 5 polling places. serving thousands of voters who then had to stand in cramped quarters to vote with a super reduced workforce. That is just, we are not Wisconsin. We are not Georgia. There is, for someone to turn it into that, we at least have a good 10 years before someone turns it into that mess. So we are set up for success here in Nebraska, which is very encouraging.
Anybody else? Well, Michael, thank you very much. This has been so enlightening and reassuring. It was good to hear of all the things that you're doing and the many hours you've put in. I'm sorry you've had to do that, but it is, I'm absolutely grateful, and I know many others are. It did go smoothly here, and that's good.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. And if you have any questions about the voting process or any concerns, our doors, well, I guess they're not always up, but our email and our, our voicemail is open for you.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.